J'ouvre maintenant.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 20 of the House of Commons Standing Transport, Infrastructure and Communities Committee. Pursuant to Standing Order 81-4 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, May 5th, 2022, the committee is meeting to study the main estimates 2022-2023. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the order of the House of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Per the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on March 10th, 2022, all those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask, except for members who are at their place during proceedings.
Committee today. For the first portion of the meeting, we are privileged to have the Minister of Transport, the Honourable Omar Al-Gabra, as well as department officials, Michael Keenan, Deputy Minister, Craig Hutton, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Policy, Kevin Brosseau, Assistant Deputy Minister, Safety and Security, Stephanie Hébert, Assistant Deputy Minister for Programs, and Ryan Pilgrim, Chief Financial Officer and Assistant Deputy Minister, Corporate Services. Minister, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to welcome you once again for appearing before committee today for the addressing of the main estimates for 2022-2023. And without further ado, it's a pleasure for me to turn the floor over to you for your opening remarks.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Bonjour, tout le monde.
Morning, everyone.
To be back here. It's my first appearance in person this committee, although it feels like I've been here quite regularly, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to always join you. Let me repeat that I'm happy to be back in person to present Transport Canada's main estimates for this fiscal year, and I want to thank the committee for the valuable work they continue to undertake this session. I welcome this opportunity to highlight some of the important work Transport Canada has been doing on behalf of Canadians. I'm pleased to be joined today by representatives from Transport Canada, Michael Keenan, Deputy Minister of Transport, Ryan Pilgrim, Assistant Deputy Minister, Corporate Services and Chief Financial Officer, Stephanie Hébert, Assistant Deputy Minister, Programs, Kevin Brosseau, Assistant Deputy Minister, Safety and Security, and Craig Hutton, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Policy. Transport Canada's mandate is to ensure that our transportation system is safe and secure, efficient, green, and innovative. Le mandat de Transport Canada est de
Transport Canada's mandate is to ensure that our transportation system is safe and secure, efficient, green, and innovative.
Expenditure in the main estimate for fiscal year 2022 to 2023 fall under four categories essential to maintaining a safe and secure transportation system while keeping people and goods moving, including $1.8 billion under efficient transportation, $419 million under safe and secure transportation, $358 million under green and innovative transportation system, and $196 million for internal services. Mr. Chair, the events of the past 2 years have reinforced the critical role that well-functioning supply chains play in supporting good jobs and keeping goods moving. Des chaînes d'approvisionnement.
Well-functioning supply chains are critical to our economy.
The quality of our transportation infrastructure and the efficiency of our trade corridors are crucial to our economic and social well-being. Here, it's important to pause for a moment to recognize the exceptional work done by our supply chains and those who work in them during one of the most uncertain times in 100 years. At the height of the pandemic, workers in the sector rose to the occasion and ensured that goods that Canadians depend on were still being delivered. To the workers in the rail, air, marine, and trucking sectors, thank you. That's not to say that there were no challenges, and our government is working to ensure that those challenges are responded to and our supply chains are enhanced. Which is why Transport Canada is requesting $1.1 billion for the National Trade Corridors Fund. The fund supports more efficient and resilient supply chains through targeted projects that ease bottlenecks and congestion in Canada's transportation system. Just last week, I was in New Brunswick to announce funding for two important projects with the St. John Port Authority and the New Brunswick Southern Railway. These projects will increase capacity to import and export goods in and out of New Brunswick and help improve supply chain efficiency for Canadian shippers. The COVID-19 pandemic has also had a profound impact on Canada's world-leading network of airports. Nous avons également
We also have seen to what degree our airline sector was affected by the pandemic.
$270 million for the Airport Critical Infrastructure Program. This program helps Canada's larger airports recover economically by making critical investments in safety, security, and connectivity to mass transit. As we work to ensure a cleaner transportation system, we're seeking $93 million for the Incentives for Zero Emission Vehicles program. The program aims to reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from transportation by increasing the adoption of ZEV vehicles through purchase incentives. I'd also like to highlight some amounts for federal agencies and crown corporations within Transport Canada. The Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, known also as CATSA, is seeking $567 million to deliver security screening of air traveler and their baggage. We understand how frustrating it's been for Canadians to experience long lines and delays at airports, and this requested funding, in addition to the approximately 400 new screening officers hired, will help reduce wait times. Marine Atlantic Inc. is seeking just under $41 million to support its year-round, constitutionally mandated ferry and seasonal ferry service. Finally, these estimates include $981 million for Via Rail to continue operations of Canada's national passenger rail transportation. Mr. Chair, as I know the committee is studying reducing travel costs and making Canada's airports more efficient, I'd like to note that several of the funding requests I've mentioned advance these objectives. The Airport Critical Infrastructure Program was created to address the loss of revenue Canada's larger airports face due to the pandemic, and help ensure that our airports remain viable and continue to provide Canadians with safe, reliable, and efficient travel options while creating and maintaining good-paying jobs in the airport sector. This program allows these airports to make needed improvements without raising fees for travelers. Likewise, the Airport Capital Assistance Program, which provides financial assistance to Canada's local and regional airports for safety-related infrastructure projects and equipment purchases, was expanded last year to help smaller airports across Canada invest in safety. In addition, the requested funding for CATSA will aid increasing volumes of baggage and passengers. Our government provided billions of dollars in support to airports and airlines to help them get through the pandemic and to ensure they could retain staff. We will continue to support airports through their recovery. And as we focus on the future, the transportation sector will be vital to Canada's economic recovery. I'm confident that the investment outlined in these main estimates will help advance a transportation system that is safer, cleaner, and more competitive. Mr. Chair, I look forward to answering my colleagues' questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. To begin the line of questioning for today, we will go with Ms. Landsman. Ms. Landsman, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and his officials for being here. I'll jump right into to my questions. Industry experts and media organizations were saying for months, and you alluded to this in your remarks, that there would be a surge in air travel post-COVID. Did the government have a plan to ensure that a transition back to post-COVID travel was, or did you have a plan at all?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to Ms. Landsman for that question. As I alluded in my remarks, there are significant dollars being asked through the main estimates to help CATSA and airports. These estimates were not written yesterday or last week or even a month ago. They were written months ago, obviously, to illustrate that we have been preparing and planning for the increased travel volume as we expected them as the pandemic is turning a corner.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Is the minister waiting for an okay on the estimates to implement any plan on post-COVID travel in airports?
Mr. Chair, not at all. We have our work has been ongoing for weeks, in fact, months. And certainly the last few weeks, there's a heightened sense of urgency given the surge that we're witnessing, not only at Canadian airports, we're witnessing those surges happen around the world, but it does not mean that we shouldn't increase our activities in responding to those surges. So we are, and we have been supporting CATSA, supporting airports, supporting CBSA to respond to this new volume level, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll go back to CATSA and, in some cases, CBSA. But is the minister aware of any other jurisdiction in the world that doesn't allow unvaccinated domestic travel?
Mr. Chair, countries around the world today still have vaccine mandates. I just traveled to Germany and the U.S. Both Germany and the U.S. require travelers to be vaccinated prior to entering their country. In fact, the U.S. requires a pre-departure test, even if you are vaccinated.
Is the minister aware, though, of any country that restricts domestic travel of their own citizens on airplanes or trains with a travel mandate?
Mr. Chair, different countries make different decisions on the policies to protect their citizens. We have all along, our government has committed to Canadians to do our best to protect the health and safety of travelers, of those who work in the industry. We consult our experts, and we consult scientists, and make decisions based on what we think is the best for Canadians and Canadian economy. And we are always assessing our measures, and we have lifted many of those measures as we have felt confident that it's safe to do so, and we are constantly assessing and reassessing. Thank you.
Chair, I'll ask. I think the answer is no. I will ask, is there any specific health advice that the minister has seen to continue 4,000 tests a day in airports, as well as stopping almost 5 million Canadians from domestic air travel because of mandates? Just any specific piece of public health advice, because we asked other members in the House, and nobody can point to any specific advice that has led the government to this decision.
Mr. Chair, over the last 2 years, we've had to implement a range of measures. Those measures have helped save lives. Canada has one of the lowest death rate in the world because the fact that Canadians continue to follow public health advice to get vaccinated. And I understand that there are always questions about the right type of measures, the right type of range of protections. We are being thoughtful and careful, and we are erring on the side of safety because we want to make sure that we are protecting lives, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, while I appreciate what Canadians have done and have done during this pandemic, my question was, has the minister seen any specific public health advice to lead him to continue to have in place mandates for domestic travel in this country? Just a yes or no.
Yes, Mr. Chair. We have all the science and advice that we get that guides our decisions. And whether it's testing at airports, random testing at airports, whether it is vaccine mandates, those are all guided by data. And as I said, the data proves that Canada has one of the lowest death rates in the world. That is something that we need to acknowledge and that we need to remain vigilant as the virus remains with us, as the pandemic is not over. We have lifted many of our public health measures, and we are constantly assessing those measures to do the right thing, to protect the health and safety of Canadians. But of course, Mr. Chair, we are guided by data, we are guided by experts, and we are guided by scientists.
Mr. Chair, the minister just said that he has seen specific health advice to keep the mandates in place in Canada. I'd like to know if he will table that specific health advice in this committee.
Mr. Chair, I am happy to table any advice, any data that the member is not aware of that proves that vaccines save lives, that prove that Canada has one of the lowest death rates in the world, that proves that vaccines have provided a great service to humanity. This is why we are continuously guided by vaccines advice and requirement, because we want to protect the health and safety of Canadians, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Landsman, and thank you very much, Minister. Next, we go to Mr. Chahal. Mr. Chahal, you have 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister and Department officials, for joining us here today at committee. I'll get right into the questions, Minister. Can you elaborate on how our government has been helping airports and CATSA plan for a recovery of pre-pandemic levels of passengers, and how this is reflected in the main estimates?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Chahal, for that question. Look, we've seen something that we had never seen in our lifetime during the pandemic, where air travel has shrunk down to down by 90%, down to 10% of what it normally is. And we've seen a devastating impact that has had on airports, on airlines, on those who work in the aviation sector. Our government stepped up because we understand the importance of airports and the aviation sector, and we've been providing significant investments in that sector that total up to $11 billion airports, airlines, and businesses and workers have received at the height of the pandemic and throughout that period. So, and that includes CATSA, Mr. Chair. So, as I mentioned in my remarks, there are significant funds being asked for through the main estimates, and this is to build on the support that we've asked for over the last year and a half to support the sector.
Thank you. Minister, is it true, as we have heard conservatives allege, that Canada is the only country that still has in place public health mandates for air travelers?
No, it's not true. And I alluded to some of those countries in my remarks. I just traveled to Germany and the U.S. Both Germany and the U.S. have public health measures for travelers. France has public health and requires test either being vaccinated or testing prior to entry. Australia, Japan. In fact, Italy still has a vaccine mandate. Italy still has a vaccine mandate for domestic travelers. So there are many measures, and I'm happy to table with committee many countries that have public health measures for travelers, either domestically or at the border.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, why do we still require travelers to wear masks? And would dropping the mask mandate do anything to speed up lines at our airports?
Mr. Chair, it's really important. If we want to address this challenge that we're witnessing, we need to fully understand what causes it. And you're seeing now, because of, which is good news, it's a good news that a lot of people are wanting to travel again. But we're seeing delays in every sector of that, every segment of that sector. We're seeing delays at airlines. We're seeing delays at airports. We're seeing delays at taxi stands. We're seeing delays across international airports: Amsterdam, Paris, London, Geneva. There are many, and Sydney in Australia. There are many delays, and what that tells us is that this is not a unique phenomenon to Canada. Having said that, we need to get to the bottom of it so we can address it. And I've talked about several causes of those. Some of them is labor shortage, and that's why we're supporting CATSA to hire more people. Some of it, bottlenecks in procedures. Some of it, people need to be informed while we're waiting in line what they need to do and what they shouldn't do at security line. So we're addressing all of those aspects to help alleviate that pressure, and we're seeing results as we are speaking today. We're seeing cuts happening to the wait times that people have experienced a few weeks ago.
Thank you, Minister. I'm just going to turn it over to MP Rogers for a question.
Thank you, Minister, for being here today. And you mentioned in your commentary about the funding for Marine Atlantic, of course, constitutionally mandated ferry crossing from Port aux Basques to North Sydney. Can you provide to the committee and to us an update on the new environmentally friendly ferry that's being constructed for that service, and as well the new administrative building that is being constructed in Port aux Basques?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Rogers. I have good news for you and for our friends in Newfoundland. The contract for the new purchase-built ferry was awarded last year, as you know, and steel cutting began this May. Construction is on track for delivery as planned in early 2024. This new vessel will replace the MV Atlantic Vision and ensure reliable and continuous ferry service to Newfoundland. As for the Port aux Basques, it's also on track. It's on scope and it's on budget. We're hoping that the construction will start this summer and for occupancy scheduled in 23-24.
Thank you, Minister. Greatly appreciate that good news for Newfoundland and Labrador. I think our time is done, Mr. Chair.
It is. Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Rogers, and thank you, Minister. Prochainement, nous avons...
Next, we have Mr. Barcelou Duval. You have 6 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Minister, for having come today to the committee with your staff, and that's very greatly appreciated. And I think it puts a smile on our faces to see that finally people are here in person around this table. And for myself, anyway, I'm very happy, and I assume it's the same thing for other members here. I wanted to ask you a question about Lac Mégantic. That is a file that I'm following closely, and I imagine your office is doing the same. This is a project that was supposed to be a unifying project to have a bypass track for that train, that it wouldn't go through the town anymore. But what we're seeing is that it's being drawn out, this project, and on the contrary, it seems to be dividing people locally. So people are up in arms about it and asking questions. So it's almost as if, in fact, this issue, it's just not going well, and the resistance seems to be significant. So do you think it's because of the fact that your government was not transparent and that it took too long to get going?
Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague for his question and for his advocacy on Lac Mégantic. Lac Mégantic is the new bypass is a priority for our government. It was part of my mandate letter, is a commitment that the Prime Minister has made and our government remains solidly committed to. And as my honourable colleague mentioned, undoubtedly now as we are getting to the final phases of the design and hopefully start construction soon and the acquisition of land, things can get complicated as we're negotiating with landowners on purchase of their land and some questions and objections that are rising because of this new project. We are dealing with this.
Thank you. There were consultations concerning the bypass, and there were recommendations made to the government, particularly to ensure that this project would be one of reconciliation in a way, that would be a project that would be more than just changing the route of the rail tracks, that it was a social project, that people could move on. And in light of those recommendations, we made some as well, saying that this new rail shouldn't be one for transporting oil that goes even faster than what that used to in the past. So do you think this could be part of the direction this could take to ensure that the project will be more acceptable for citizens in the area?
Chair, I welcome all the recommendations and the advice that we're getting from our colleagues, including this committee. We are now at a critical phase. As my colleague mentioned, it's getting delicate because many landowners want to negotiate a fair deal for themselves, want to ensure that the path of the bypass is acceptable to them. We're working very diligently and delicately with our colleagues. This issue crosses partisan line, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of my colleagues in the House of Commons and here in committee who understand the importance of the bypass and expressed willingness to work together to address all of those questions.
Well, Minister, I would have liked you to respond to the recommendation that I mentioned, and if you have a moment, I would appreciate it. But what we've seen presently is that people are up in arms, and I feel as though if things had been done properly from the beginning, that this wouldn't be the case. If communications had been better and if things hadn't dragged on, we wouldn't find ourselves in the situation we are in now. And I also feel that there's now a sense of urgency to try to move forward with this, even though at such a long time nothing seemed to happen. So my question to you is, do you not have the impression that your government's cutting corners in order to meet deadlines, even though there's very little work that's been done in the past?
Respectfully, I disagree with my honourable colleague. In fact, if we have delayed the deadline that we had committed to because of the feedback that we got from community members, because of the feedback that we had from the mayor and the neighbourhood in that area. We want to make sure that we address all the questions. And look, we have representations on the ground there all the time. I visited Lac-Mégantic. My team have visited Lac-Mégantic. We are doing everything we can to maintain open channels of communication, to respond to the questions that landowners and community members have. We are dealing with this issue with extreme delicacy, but yes, we remain committed to building this project as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Donc, avez-vous l'impression?
So, do you have the feeling that you've lost control of it? Because costs, which were supposed to be some 100 million, are now up to about 400 million today, and there's a great deal of resistance on the ground. So I don't have the sense that you really listened to the recommendations made to you so far.
Mr. Chair, we remain committed to this project. It's true that costs have gone up, like every other major project costs. But we think it's really important that we do it right, and if it meant delaying the project a few months, so we continuously updating community members, responding to their questions, working with landowners, we will do that because we understand how important it is to maintain social license for that project. But I also know, Mr. Chair, that members and community members and residents of Lac-Mégantic want to see this bypass built. The delay is something that they're reluctantly agreeing to, but we all agree we need to build this as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Mr. Macrack, you have 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today with your officials. I'd like to start with some questions about the airport delays, obviously something on many people's minds. And looking at the main estimates for CATSA, for the Canadian Air Security Authority, for 2022-23, there's $567 million for CATSA. Now that's down significantly from last year. Last year, there was $859 million of estimated expenditures for CATSA. Can you explain why the money that is being spent on CATSA is decreasing precisely at a time when we're experiencing all of these severe staffing issues and delays for travelers at our major airports?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank my colleague for that question. In fact, there's an additional $300 million on top of that in the supplementary estimates. So we are restoring funding to that level, to last year's level. It's just been broken into different chunks.
Related to this, we're hearing many frustrations from workers and from the unions that represent them when it comes to screening officers at airports and some of the working conditions. We're hearing about challenges with things like bathroom breaks. We're seeing extreme overtime and forced extensions to overtime, missed breaks, washroom access, all of these things, as well as uncompetitive pay. And I'm wondering if the working conditions faced by screening officers and other airport workers is something you're concerned about, and what role it's playing in the challenges you're experiencing hiring more screening officers for our airports.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I am always concerned when I hear workplace complaints. It's important for Transport Canada, for me personally, for our government, that every worker has a safe and well-paid job environment. I'm going to avoid talking about this particular case because, as you know, CATSA is responsible for managing its relationship with its workplace. However, our expectation is that ensuring that everybody who works for CATSA has a safe, respectful, a decent workplace that is free of harassment.
Are you concerned about current work conditions?
I'm concerned about all work environment, and I think every employer, particularly either Government of Canada or Crown corporations, must be concerned with its own work environment, must always pay attention to the feedback they're getting from their workers and unions, and must work collaboratively with its union to address all of these issues.
Minister, I'm going to move on to a different topic. On March 9th, you released a request for expressions of interest related to your government's high-frequency rail project between Toronto and Quebec City. Now, this is Canada's highest volume rail corridor for passenger rail. And this expression of interest that your government released envisions a private operator coming in, building this new high-frequency rail line, operating it, setting the fares, setting the schedules, and also operating the other rail service besides high-frequency rail on that corridor. This sounds to a lot of Canadians like privatization, if not privatization of Via Rail, at least privatization of Canada's busiest passenger rail corridor. Why is that your government's vision?
Mr. Chair, I understand Mr. Bachrach's question, and he's making some assumptions, but let me be very clear. First of all, this is great news for Via and Via passengers. This is going to be the largest infrastructure project in Canada's history, and it's going to revolutionize that corridor. We want to build that corridor right, and we are seeking input from different players in the sector. And by the way, in many of my meetings with other ministers around the world, I've been asking them for ideas and suggestions about how they operate their rail network. What we are doing right now is we're inviting stakeholders to submit proposals based on the scope of work that we outlined. And we're asking for, of course, maintaining a minimum of that standard, but we're asking, can you also do better? So this is a massive infrastructure project. It's going to continue to be a Via project. This is not a privatization of Via, but we want to build it the right way for Canadians to ensure that they get value for money.
Minister, you said earlier that this is a very exciting project for Via Rail. If this is such an exciting project for Via Rail, why did the CEO quit?
Mr. Chair, I don't think you want this committee to do a performance review on individual employees or talk about someone's decision to quit. That is a human resources matter. It's a privacy matter. I want to wish Ms. Garneau the best. She has led Via Rail with integrity, and I want to thank her for her service. Via still has a lot of projects on the horizon, one not the least of which this exciting corridor, and I am excited to be to play a small role in this project.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach, and thank you, Minister. Next, we have Mr. Ellis. Mr. Ellis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being here. Just as a point of clarification for the committee, air travel in Italy is really allowed for those who are fully immunized, who have a certificate of recovery of COVID, and who could also have a negative COVID test. So just to be completely transparent, Mr. Minister, there are several ways that people besides being fully immunized could actually travel in Italy. Question, you talked, Mr. Minister, about seeing the data that would inform decision-making. You kind of went down a bit of a different route than what my colleague, Ms. Landsman, was actually asking. And what we're curious, sir, is understanding the data that allows you to make decisions on those folks who aren't immunized and when they can actually travel. You alluded to the fact that there is data. That's the data that we would like presented and tabled at that committee. Would you present and table that data here at this committee, sir?
First, Mr. Chair, my colleague talks about Italy, and other countries, what the Conservatives' motion wants to do, they want to drop all mandate, Mr. Chair. They're not talking about making different adjustments or changing.
But the question was really
they
related
are
to tabling
asking
of data,
to drop
Mr. Chair.
all
it
mandates.
really wasn't related to Italy. Italy was a statement, not a question. The question really is related to the data that is forming the decision this government is making with respect to travel in Canada. So that's the question, Mr. Chair, that I would like to have the answer to. Will the minister be transparent and table that data to this committee? Yes or no?
Mr. Chair, you can't make a statement and not expect you to respond to it. But having said that, I am more than happy to provide data that proves that vaccines continue to save lives, that vaccines are...
Question is here. The question is really related to the restrictions that continue to be burdened upon Canadians, and we would like to see the data that really informs those decisions. That's what we're looking for, Mr. Minister.
Mr. Ellis, and I can appreciate that. We've just had discussions, though, with our interpreters in various meetings with regards to those talking over other members. It's very difficult for them to do so. So if you ask a question, please provide significant time for the person you're asking the question to respond.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm more than happy to hear the answer to that particular question. That'd be lovely.
Mr. Chair, if the Conservatives are looking for data that shows how effective vaccine at helping lives, there's abundance of data, and I'm happy to provide it. It is government's policy that make decision based on the data that proves that vaccines save lives is implemented. So we act based on the science, and the science is clear. Vaccines save lives. Masks reduce transmission. So the data is clear, and then it's governments who act based on that data, and we're very happy to provide that data to the committee members and members of the House of Commons.
I guess I'll ask one more time, Mr. Chair, if I could. What is the data that is showing these mandates need to continue in their current form? Not about deaths. We totally understand that. There's no issue. What is the data that continues to inform the decision-making with respect to continuing these punitive mandates for approximately 5.7 million Canadians selected for special treatment?
I'm not sure how to respond to that question. Mr. Chair, he said it's not about death. It is about death. It's about injury. It's about the health and safety of Canadians. And as I've illustrated, there's countries around the world, provinces within Canada still have vaccine mandates in different sectors, in different segments of their economy. We are doing the best we can to protect the health and safety of Canadians. I understand not everyone has to agree with our decision, but what we're doing is we're doing our best to protect the health and safety of Canadians. We're doing our best to protect the resilience of our supply chains. We are constantly reassessing. We've lifted many of those measures, and the existing ones are still under review every once in a while to make sure that they are appropriate. But we are guided by the desire to protect the health and safety of Canadians, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. So understanding that some of the mandates have been lifted, supposedly that would be based on science. Yes or no?
Of course.
So therefore, the science exists, which no one has ever actually seen. That is the science with which you are making the decision. That's the science that I would love to see tabled at this committee, Mr. Chair. And if we could see that science which is informing the decision, that would be very helpful for Canadians, because then they would know what to expect in the future. So could the minister please table that particular science that he's alluded to?
Mr. Chair, the science is clear that vaccines save lives, that masks reduce transmission. What a government has to do is also assess the risk. I think what my colleague is also talking about, risk. We are mitigating to the best of our ability how we can protect the health and safety of Canadians. Risk level change. Data and the evolution of the virus change. We've seen when Omicron hit, we had to reintroduce some public health measures that we had lifted before. So we are constantly responding to the changing and the evolving virus, Mr. Chair, but we are always guided by our desire to protect the health and safety of Canadians.
Thank you very much, Minister. Next, we have Ms. Koutrakis. Ms. Koutrakis, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for appearing before this committee. I know firsthand how, charged your schedule has been in the last little while, and I wanted to personally thank you for all your great work, and to the department that is all the officials that are here with us today. Minister, in your view, what is the cause for the airport delays we are seeing? We've seen a lot of comments in the media. So what, in your view, is the cause for airport delays?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague and Parliamentary Secretary for her excellent work. First let me just be clear, as I said earlier, we're seeing this phenomena across the world. We're seeing this different airports. Just this morning, Dublin's airport had a report of 1,000 passengers missing their flights. So that does not mean that we shouldn't act. I'm not saying this to instill complacency. It's the opposite. But what I want to say is that this phenomena is happening everywhere because we're witnessing a surge of travel demand after the pandemic. So there are several causes to it. There's labor shortage, and we're acting on that. There are significant peaks and valleys with travel volume. So we're seeing at certain times of the day where we have exceptionally large volumes, where other times of the day we have certain valleys. And that's why, depending on the time you're at the airport, you can get through their security with no wait time at all, or sometimes more than usual. We're seeing scheduled flights, airlines, when it comes to scheduling their flights, there's massive fluidity there and changing of flights, scheduling quickly. And we're seeing, as I said, passengers need to be prepared as they are crossing the security line to ensure that they take their fluids and their laptops out. And we're reacting to that. That's why part of our action plan is to inform travelers as they're waiting in line to make sure that they take their laptops out, to take their fluids out. But we want to make sure that we address all aspects of the travel issues to make sure that everyone is prepared. We're working with airlines. We've set up a working group with airports, with airlines, with CATSA, with CBSA, to address all of these bottlenecks, to make sure that we respond to this and we ensure that passengers are able to pass through as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, through you, I'd like to ask the Minister, as a segue to his response. We've heard, in previous testimony from various business groups, their comments. And I would like to know your opinion. How much credence should Canadians put in advice provided by business groups lobbying for the ending of mandates when these groups have no public health expertise? In fact, I was the one that asked that question, and they did admit to saying that they were not health experts. So how much credence should Canadians put in this type of advice?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I invite all stakeholders and all Canadians to offer their input. We take all input seriously and all feedback seriously. And then we assess the feedback, we assess the experts' advice, and we aim to make the right decision that protects the health and safety of Canadians, but also maintains fluidity for passengers and goods. I think we just need to assess the feedback that we get based on its own merit, but we welcome all input from all stakeholders.
And one final question. I noticed that the main estimates also propose significant new funding designed to help support our airports. Can you elaborate on the goals of these programs, and how are we measuring whether these goals are achieved?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to an earlier question, I responded about the support that we've been providing to the aviation sector, including airports. I talked about two critical programs in my opening remarks, the Airport Critical Infrastructure Program and the Airport Capital Improvement Program. They're both meant to help support airports, particularly to cover some of the shortage and revenues during the pandemic. to build and expand their facilities, to enhance safety, to ensure that there's connectivity to mass transit in their communities. So we've been providing significant investment, and we, of course, sign agreements with the airports to ensure that those projects are delivered on time, on budget, and to achieve the public policy objectives that they seek to achieve.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koutrakis. Thank you very much, Minister. Prochainement, nous avons Mr.
And now we have Mr. Barsalou Duval. You have 2.5 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Minister, in 2020, you asked the Canada Transportation Office to change rules to protect passengers to ensure that they would be refunded or reimbursed if there were canceled flights. We saw that throughout the pandemic, that people were not reimbursed for their costs. So I'd like to know where we're headed now with this amendment so that we will know whether your next regulation will be effective or not.
And that's an important question. When the Bill of Rights, the Passenger Bill of Rights, was tabled in the House of Commons and passed, certainly none of us envisioned a pandemic, and the pandemic exposed that there are some of the provisions of that of those regulations did not take into account such an emergency. That's why during the pandemic, we offered assistance to airlines so they can provide refunds. And now we are enhancing and improving the regulation to ensure that that is taken into account moving forward.
Pouvez-vous nous assurer?
Could you assure us that in the new version of the regulations, there won't be any loopholes for the airlines who might once again try to find ways to not refund passengers?
Chair, our objective is to make sure that those regulations are done to achieve the public policy objectives. And we do our best to ensure that there are no loopholes. I would invite committee members to offer suggestions and ideas how to make sure we can achieve that.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much. Minister, one of your responsibilities is CN and also companies like Air Canada, who both seem to have tremendous difficulty with the Official Languages Act, and they also seem to have tremendous difficulty with the enforcement and use of French within their businesses. So I'd like to know currently, you have Bill 13 that might be passed soon, Bill C-13, and what you're trying to do is to ensure that other federally regulated industries and that businesses that are not yet subject to the Official Languages Act be so, like Air Canada and CN. So given the situation that is so unfortunate at CN and at Air Canada, how would it be an improvement of the situation to apply Bill C-13 to other federally regulated businesses? And when it's with Bill 101 in Quebec, we will probably risk seeing the same unfortunate situation we see with Air Canada in Quebec. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time for an answer, but perhaps you could answer by email. Thank you.
We have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, you have 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, it's been 1 year and 3 months since the tugboat Ingenika sank near Kitimat, taking the lives of Troy Pearson and Charlie Craig. Can your department point to a single tangible safety improvement that has been put in place to avoid similar deaths?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, I will perhaps pass it on to Mr. Brosseau to respond to that question, because I know we have put in place some measures.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Indeed, we have carried out. We have, first of all, an oversight program with respect to those vessels of a particular size. The tugs on the West Coast tend to be under a certain size, and we have an oversight regime that has been amplified with respect to that. The other elements, of course, is in fact being able to deploy on the West Coast, have an increased presence, which is very important. Communication as well with tugboat operators, and our officials are actively engaged in that work on the West Coast as well, in particular, Mr. Chair. But those would be tangible examples of the work that we are doing with respect to ensuring the safety of tugboats.
Thank you, Mr. Brousseau. Now, I had a conversation with a tugboat operator just recently in Prince Rupert, and he pointed to something called a tug-to-tow ratio, which is an area of very specific concern for small tugs under 15 tons. Are there any rules currently, like rules, legislation, that are enforceable and specific concerning tug-to-tow ratios for tugboats under 15 tons?
Mr. Chair, I will have to get back in terms of being able to speak to particular rules. I think that what's really important to remember, Mr. Chair, are the safety management system regulations for all vessels, which will come into force in the coming months. But with respect to that specific question, Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I'll be able to respond to that by consulting the marine safety experts within Transport Canada.
So the Auditor General has raised a lot of concerns regarding safety management systems in other sectors, such as rail safety. How do you intend to avoid those same problems when applying safety management systems in the marine industry?
Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Brousseau. Once again, we're out of time, but I do invite you to provide a response, written response following the committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Dowdle. Mr. Dowdle, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here today. I just want a quick comment first. I was kind of disgusted to hear a committee member trying to really downplay witnesses there. I don't think that's good, but I did enjoy the minister's answer, so I want to thank you for that. Just a couple quick things. I don't know, Mr. Minister, did you get an opportunity to see or hear from the May 16th committee when we began the study on reducing red tape?
Yes, I know that the committee has issued a report, and I can't remember if Transport Canada is issuing a response to it or not, but yes, I got a chance to go over the report.
Good. So you would know that from that meeting that we had, quite a few people were a little upset, perhaps. I know you said here significant dollars that the governments gave. I hear that boasted about quite often in the House as well, but sometimes it's better to boast about results. And from what I heard from a lot of the individuals on here, they thought that there was things that could be done at no cost that would probably help the aviation business. One of the ladies was Manette Pasher of Canadian Airports Council, and she actually wrote in the paper today, to reduce or eliminate delays at custom, the most useful action we could take would be to remove public health measures and mandatory random testing at the airport itself. Around the world, 62 countries, including New Zealand, Sweden, Israel, and now Australia, have already removed testing and COVID protocols. Canada must do the same, or else perhaps move it off-site. What are your thoughts on moving it off-site, and have you heard that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And look, it's really important to always be challenged and always look for opportunities to improve efficiency. But also we need to be reminded and remind ourselves that some of these measures, as cumbersome as they may seem, are important to protect the health and safety of Canadians. And we want to always reassess. We want to always assess and reassess the application of those rules. To answer your question directly, we are at Transport Canada looking at ways to work with airports to move testing off-site. That's something that we are looking at as a way. But let me remind everyone, we are going through a pandemic, and we are seeing a lot of...
I know, Mr. Minister. I just have one more question. I don't have much time here. Your predecessor stated that airlines need to treat passengers like people, not numbers. Under your watch, government agencies have authored the worst passenger right violations in Canadian history. Hours to get through security, infants trapped in airplanes when they land for hours, and staying in the custom halls. Travelers are being detained and delayed. It is unacceptable. Have you written to the CTA to have them investigate these gross violations? And have you asked your department to draft standard of care and obligations for PHAC, CBSA, and CATSA?
Mr. Chair, let me repeat my understanding and empathy to those who've been waiting in lines at airports. This is something that needs to be responded to. I've made it clear in every conversation I've had with CATSA, with airports, with airlines, that this is something that needs to be addressed. And we are offering resources. We are offering resources and guidance and support every way we can. But having said that, I want to remind everyone that we're still in a pandemic. We're seeing delays across not just airports around the world. We're seeing delays across all sectors of the economy. This is the aftermath of the challenges that the pandemic has posed on our economy. And having said that, we need to react. We need to be supportive. We need to do everything we can to address these challenges, and we are doing so, Mr. Chair.
Okay, one other problem that we had, there are a lot of issues, was the carbon tax and the extra cost that it has on fuel. Is the government looking at anything to help in that way?
Mr. Chair, we are working with the sector on sustainable fuel and new technologies to identify and work with new fuels that will reduce emissions, yet be able to operate a plane safely and efficiently. So absolutely, we are working with the airline sector. That,
Do you know that Canada is 107th right now in the world in cost competitiveness in the airfield?
Mr. Chair, it's a priority for me to ensure that we have a competitive airspace sector, an airline sector. It is true that Canada, given its unique landscape and geography, that we have some challenges, but our priority is the safety of Canadians, but also the efficiency and productivity of the aviation sector.
Well, let's try and get that number down a little bit from 107.
Mr. Dowdall, and thank you very much, Minister. The last 3 minutes that we have will go to Mr. Iachino. Mr. Iachino, the floor is yours. You have 3 minutes.
Bon matin, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Minister, as well as for the presence of the Deputy Ministers here. There has been a significant increase for 2023 in the main estimates, 39% more than the previous year. So that explains the increase in planned spending for the National Trade Corridors Fund. Can you explain why the government is proposing to increase the fund for that particular initiative?
Thank you to my colleague for that question, Mr. Iachino. Look, it's important to actually talk about this because one of the reasons why there is an increase in the estimates is because of the National Trade Corridor Fund. This Trade Corridor Fund is intended to enhance resilience in our supply chains. And our government had the foresight from last year to include an additional $1.9 billion of investment into the Trade Corridor Fund to ensure that our supply chains are enhanced and strengthened. For a total now of $4.2 billion over the last 4 or 5 years. And this year's budget also offered almost another $500 million. So the reason why there's this significant increase is to reflect the increase and the recapitalization that we've seen in the National Trade Corridor Fund.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. Could you give us examples of projects funded by the FNCC?
My visit to New Brunswick last week to support the St. John port. But here are some examples. There's $50 million for the Montreal airport to renovate the cargo deck. There's another $50 million to the City of Montreal to improve road access between Trans-Canada Highway and the Port of Montreal. $33 million to Port Trois-Rivières to increase cargo capacity there by almost 50%. $5.5 million to the Hamilton-Oshawa Port Authority for Pier 10 export expansion project. $5 million to the Alberta Midland Railway Terminal Phase 2 expansion. And the list goes on. I'd be happy to provide additional examples to you, Mr. Iachino.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Iachino.
On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you once again for appearing here today and for providing us with your testimony. Colleagues, I'm going to have to suspend the meeting now for 2 minutes so I can let the minister and his department officials leave, and we can set up to welcome the Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Infrastructure and Communities. Honorable colleagues, today, hearing for the second half of our meeting, we are overjoyed to welcome the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Infrastructure and Communities, the Honorable Dominic LeBlanc. And he is joined by department officials, Kelly Gillis, Deputy Minister, Infrastructure and Communities, Alison O'Leary, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Communities and Infrastructure Programs, as well as Glenn Campbell, Assistant Deputy Minister, Investment, Partnerships and Innovation. Minister, it is a pleasure to welcome you and your team here before committee for the first time in person in quite some time. Minister, before I turn it over to you for your opening remarks, I believe that Mr. Badaway, you had a quick motion you wanted to get out of the way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most members, if not all members, have received the travel budget coming into the third quarter of this coming year, September, and I'd like to put a motion forward to accept that travel budget, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Badaway, and I believe, Mr. Clerk, the reason we're doing this now is because we're on a tight deadline. So is there any objections to getting that out of the way at the beginning of the meeting? Seeing none, it is adopted. Honourable Minister, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Mr. Chair, thank you, and I want to assure you and colleagues that I share your overjoydom for being here with you and assure you that the pleasure is in fact mine. Mr. Chair, I am looking forward to this opportunity to discuss with you how our team at the Infrastructure Department is delivering for Canadians. Mr. Chair, I won't repeat it, but you properly welcome the 3 senior officials who are joining me today, and if there are specific technical questions, obviously, they'll be happy to answer questions from colleagues. Monsieur le Président, notre...
Mr. Chairman, our government remains focused on building a better future, a more prosperous, resilient, and sustainable Canada. That's why we continue to take strong action on climate action to make life more affordable, grow our economy, and create good jobs for the middle class across the country. As we continue this work, we are increasing our investments in infrastructure to support Canadians. Our goal is to strengthen our economy and our communities, and to create new social and economic opportunities for families, youth, and seniors.
Work with all orders of government, as well as Indigenous communities and other partners. Those partners are helping us bring to Canadians major bridge projects, for example, zero-emission transit options, and affordable housing. We are helping to improve ventilation in public buildings and investing in green and inclusive community buildings as well. We are investing in sustainable water and wastewater, as well as natural infrastructure. And today, Mr. Chair, I'm here to discuss Infrastructure Canada's 2022-2023 main estimates so we can continue this important work. Infrastructure Canada is seeking $9.3 billion in the 2022-2023 main estimates. The majority of this amount, $6.8 billion, is towards grants and contributions. The remainder includes $242 million towards operating expenditures, $13.8 million towards capital expenditures, as well as $2.3 billion in total statutory estimates, mainly for the Canada Community Building Fund, formerly known as the gas tax. Le montant demandé dans le
The amount requested in this year's main estimates represents a net increase of $2.5 billion over our 2021-2022 main estimates, the majority of which is grants and contributions funding. Approximately 25% of the increase in grants and contributions is for new programs announced in the fall 2020 economic statement and the 2021 budget, which will be implemented over the next several years. These programs include a number of key programs, including the green and inclusive community buildings, and I referred to it earlier, the permanent transit program, the natural infrastructure fund, and ventilation funding under the COVID-19 component of investing in Canada's infrastructure, and a top-up to the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund.
% of the grants and contributions increase is for existing programs, such as the Public Transit Infrastructure Fund, the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, and the additional responsibility of Reaching Home, Canada's homelessness strategy. The increase in operating expenditures of $86.3 million includes resources secured to deliver the new programs, as well as the mandated transfer to the Department of responsibilities for the Homelessness Policy Directorate, which had previously been, as colleagues would know, with the Department of Employment and Social Development, and these, of course, are under my colleague, the Minister of Housing. Statutory funding has seen an increase of $8.4 million, related largely to employee benefit plan requirements tied to increases in operating resources. And finally, Mr. Chair, capital expenditures, meanwhile, represent a decrease in capital funding of $52.4 million compared to the estimates of last year, due primarily to the sunsetting of funding in the 2021-2022 budget, for example, for land purchases related to the Gordie Howe International Bridge and the Samuel de Champlain Bridge Corridor project, with the latter, the Champlain Bridge, in your great province of Quebec, Mr. Chair, to be completed in late 2022. So the year ahead promises to be a busy one. We think it will be a productive one for the team at Infrastructure Canada. We're excited by the new programming as I said, that was made available largely in the budget of last year, 2021, and the fall economic update of 2020. And I look forward during the questions, Mr. Chair, to speaking with you and our colleagues about our department's work and our commitment to serving Canadians in the best way possible. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister.
Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and the department officials for being here today. There's obviously a lot of joy in the occasion, and we share in that, although we do have questions. Minister, I want to talk a little bit further about the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which I think, as you know, this committee has recommended its disbandment based on failures and based on expert testimony that came before this committee. And related to that, my understanding is this committee passed a unanimous motion in March of 2021 that certainly preceded my time on this committee and your time as minister, where we asked for details on the CEO and director bonuses. And I know there was a response provided a few months later that was less than satisfactory, certainly lacked some accountability. So I want to fast forward a year, now that you're in the chair, and ask whether or not, as the last fiscal year ended, whether there were any bonuses for CEOs or senior managers at the CIB, and if you could provide any details on that.
Well, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Muse, thank you for the question. And we've obviously taken note of this committee's work with respect to the Infrastructure Bank. I think we acknowledge that any large new undertaking like the Infrastructure Bank, which was created probably 5 years ago, had some initial growing pains. We believe that the Infrastructure Bank is on a much better footing perhaps than it was 4 years ago. I had a chance in Vancouver last week to meet with the board chair. With respect to executive compensation, and that is a very reasonable question, obviously the effort in the case of recruiting, for example, the current CEO with whom I met in Ottawa a couple of months ago, was a partner at McKinsey & Company and had worked in Infrastructure Ontario, had very considerable experience in this. So my understanding is all of the board, of course, sets the pay and compensation for senior executives. It's entirely consistent with similar organizations in terms of the practice of recruiting the talent. But if you have specific questions on the bonuses, Mr. Campbell might have that precise information, or I'm happy to forward you what information is publicly available.
Sure, and I think that's what we're asking for, what is publicly available and what was provided to the committee when the question was last asked. And if that could be tabled with the committee, that would be appreciated. And related to that, what are the metrics that are associated with those performance bonuses? I know in my 25 years in the private sector prior to politics, when you've got a situation like the Canada Infrastructure Bank that has completed 0 projects, I wouldn't have gotten a performance bonus for 0 results. So, I don't know if you could comment further on that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. So again, I don't want to at all diminish our colleagues' experience in the private sector, but to say it has completed 0 projects, I think is an oversimplification. In the last 18 months, there has been a very significant increase in the capital funding made available. It's in the tune of $7.2 billion has been put out to 28 or 30 projects. It represents a total capital investment of over $20 billion. But again, we're happy to provide the committee, as I know the Infrastructure Bank has made public in the last few weeks, a detailed list of all the projects with which they're involved, the funding that they have allocated. And I'm very confident over the coming months we'll see the Infrastructure Bank investing in every part of the country in projects that will be very important to Canadians. So I'm confident that the last 18 months is different than perhaps the previous 2 years, but I'm very confident that the next 18 months will also show a significant increase in their activity.
So to that, when you were here last, the end of February, so 3 months ago, you admitted that the CIB needed to raise its game in terms of the pace of attracting private sector investment into these projects. Certainly, one of the raison d'etre of the CIB, and you indicated that you're going to be communicating your expectations to the bank. So 3 months later, what has been done, and are you satisfied with the progress to date thus far? And what can you point to that would be of interest to this committee?
Again, Mr. Chair, thank you. Very, I think, very reasonable questions. I certainly share the impatience of members of this committee and of Canadians in terms of seeing the value that the bank can bring to these kind of projects. I've had a number of conversations both with the CEO and the board chair. As I say, we met with the board chair. The deputy and I were in British Columbia last week, spent a couple of hours with Ms. Vrooman, explained to her what I think is an understandable desire on the part of all Canadians to see the bank relevant in big and small projects across the country. They have invested, as I said, $7.2 billion of bank capital, which has attracted, as of last month, $7.6 billion in private and institutional investment. I certainly take your point that in the initial sort of description of the bank's mandate, there was an expectation or a hope that that private capital portion would be higher. I think we're going to see that grow over time.
So may I ask, again, last time you were here, there were 33 projects that for which had been started, none completed. Where are we at today, 3 months later? Have we accelerated that, or we achieved a higher number?
So we are, of course, accelerating that, but perhaps Mr. Campbell, if you have examples of specific projects, just to use as an example, Glenn, that might help Mr. Muse.
Sorry, Mr. Campbell, we're unfortunately out of time for that segment, but I invite you to submit that information by email following the committee today. Next, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Minister, for being here with us today. I'm going to start off, Minister, by expressing my appreciation for your file. You have infrastructure, you have intergovernmental affairs, and you have communities, which is paramount with respect to the direction that we're taking as a government to ensure that ongoing communication gets strengthened, because we do recognize that a lot of the files and a lot of the issues that we're dealing with are cross-ministerial. And I congratulate you for doing that very successfully. With that said, you've been dealing with different departments, different orders of government, Indigenous communities, and of course, as I said earlier, to ensure that strengthened communications. In particular, to my question, between transport, for example, finance, provincial government, municipal government, private sector, and in being down in Washington this past week, one of the things that we all agreed upon binationally was the need to strengthen our supply chains, our trade corridors, be more strategic in those investments that we make, not just locally, domestically, but between both countries. So by integrating the binational strategic trade corridors, including integrating binational capital investments, ensuring, once again, underline, binational fluidity within our supply chains, and we look at, for example, the Great Lakes as an example, can you elaborate on the proposed new funding of $79.1 million to protect our coastlines and waterways, what this money will pay for, and why it is so important?
Mr. Chair, thank you, and Mr. Badaway, thank you for your comments. I'll offer a couple of opening comments, and perhaps the deputy can offer some specific information with respect to the waterways that you mentioned. But you're right. Our department works very closely with Transport Canada on precisely that supply chain resilience. You're absolutely right to say that Canadians are concerned, and properly so, with the security of supply chains, their resilience, the binational aspect of infrastructure, critical. We saw what happened to the Canadian economy when the Ambassador Bridge was blocked some months ago, and what that meant for the thousands and thousands of workers who were on layoff in your province. That, I think, reminded Canadians of those very real choke points. That's why, obviously, the Gordie Howe Bridge is a key part of our department's effort to build some resilience in a critical supply chain piece. I have conversations with the Minister of Transport often about where the infrastructure department can complement some of the trade corridors funding. We don't want to displace their ability to properly identify, as they did last week in St. John, New Brunswick, infrastructure upgrades to the Port of St. John to make it easier for container rail service, for example. So they're properly focused on that, but there are things that our department can do that will be complementary, that will support those investments and make sure that we're getting the very best benefit for the money that that department or our department are trying to put in. But with respect to the waterways, I don't know, Kelly, if you want to
Sorry, thank you for the question. I don't have the details of that particular investment. Perhaps we can follow up afterwards to find out which program and which department that particular investment is made through for the waterways. And certainly one really important investment that we are making that is between our two countries is the investment we're doing through the building of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, which will be a really important trade corridor between our two countries, which is advancing, and we can see it actually now that you're there, the progress in the construction that's being made.
Thank you, Ms. Gillis. Thank you, Minister. Now, just to dig a bit deeper, and when we look at what Transport's doing with the Ports Modernization Review, with the St. Lawrence Seaway Review, and many other reviews that we're doing with respect to the Great Lakes, the Blue Economy Strategy, Minister, how do you see infrastructure, as you mentioned earlier, aligning, for example, with the NTCF fund to ensure that we have that fluidity, to ensure, again, binationally, that not only with respect to policy legislation, but equally, if not more importantly, with respect to integrating those capital investments, that being road, rail, air, water, and ensuring that our distribution system is being integrated when it comes to distribution and logistics, but ultimately to meet the demands of fluidity.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you to Mr. Badaway for that question. I entirely share your view that we need to look across the Government of Canada to see how different federal departments making investments, I think of the high-frequency rail investments, for example, that Transport Canada is working on. Our department has a modest role in support of that effort. If you look, as the deputy said, at the Gordie Howe Bridge, on peut penser au pont Champlain.
You could think of the Champlain Bridge in the Quebec region.
Supply routes, critical for the safe movement of goods and people. And the ones that obviously have the highest focus across the government will be these binational, as you properly noted, Mr. Badaway, infrastructure investments. So I think one of the things that, back to the previous question around the infrastructure bank, that we can do is ensure that the infrastructure bank, which can bring to the conversation different expertise, different financing instruments, we think that that's part of working, for example, with other partners in the government, but private sector partners or other orders of government, as we try and find the best way. In a time when fiscal resources are necessarily limited, you want to make sure that we're not tripping over one another, or that if the Government of Canada is doing something that's complementary to something that the Government of Ontario or Quebec or New Brunswick is doing, then it in fact makes those dollars go further and achieve the objectives that we have in a more efficient way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway, and thank you, Minister. Prochaine matter.
And now we have Mr. Barsalou-Duval. You have 6 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Minister, to the committee. It's been a long time that we haven't had the opportunity to meet in person, so obviously that's something that makes everybody be in a good mood. The questions that I have for you are on the last budget, because on page 69 of the last budget, I was somewhat I asked myself a few questions, and perhaps you'll be in a position to answer these questions, because what it says is that the government expects to move forward the deadline so that provinces will devote all of the remaining funding of the Infrastructure Investing in Canada Fund to priority projects for by March 31st, 2023, and then all funds not used by that point in time will be used for other projects or reallocated. So if I understand from this that instead of having till 2025, we have to now spend those funds by 2023 for this Investing in Canada Fund. So I'd just like to know what will happen with the unused funds. Does it mean they'll no longer be part of that particular fund? Will it be reallocated to other areas? So it's not necessarily money that will stay with those provinces for them to spend? Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Barsalou-Duval, for the question. I believe that it's important to see that, yes, the Minister of Finance has declared that the provinces that have money left over in federal, provincial programs, Quebec, Canada, New Brunswick, within these funds, they have to be attributed to projects by 2023. The money doesn't have to be spent necessarily by then. But in the case of your province, with Quebec, we have to agree on a list of projects that we will fund. Several projects can take several years. And so funds can be allocated to those for 10 years after that deadline. But if we cannot agree with the province of Quebec or the province of New Brunswick, for example, on the list of projects, that the funds will be taken back. Okay, so that is to say that there may be money that comes out later, but the decision will have to have been taken, the project will have to be submitted before 2023, end of March. I ask the question because when you look at the bilateral agreement signed between Quebec and the federal government in 2018, your government, indeed, for infrastructure projects, what we can see in the agreement is that Quebec has up until the 31st of March 2023 to submit projects. So what I understand from that is that this agreement is no longer valid. No, the agreement, in fact, is functioning very well. I've had a discussion, a very constructive discussions with Ms. Lebel, Sonia Lebel, just last week, as to infrastructure projects that we're wanting to do in partnership with the province of Quebec. So I'm not at all pessimistic that we'll be able to take decisions with the province of Quebec for the allocation of these funds. The problem that we had, for example, in BC, where I was last week, there's no money left. In Manitoba, no money left. In Ontario, zero. So all of these provinces are after us. Prince Edward Island has maybe 15% of unallocated funds, maybe 30%. So a lot of provinces, Manitoba was indeed at zero in terms of non-allocated funds. So in a certain way, Quebec isn't the worst. It's Newfoundland and Labrador, followed by my province, my home province of New Brunswick. So the Minister of Finance is anxious to have these funds allocated to projects. But I have premiers, such like the Premier of Ontario, who's saying to me, what's the 2.0 version of this program? So I have a duty and an obligation to these other provinces to work together with them and to see what might be the second version of this program. And I explained this to Ms. Lebel last week. And furthermore, we agreed to meet again specifically to see how, in the second version, we might be able to find something that indeed respects Quebec's interests, but the federal government's as well. Well, Minister, if I understand correctly, if the money is, well, not spent, but if it isn't allocated before the 31st of March 2023, the money comes back into the Treasury and you'll find other means to, or ways to use that money. So all that is to say that the bilateral agreement of 2018, which speaks about 2025, March 31st, that's not valid anymore. So you have unilaterally modified or changed this agreement without any discussions. And the direction that the agreement is taken, Quebec didn't find this normal. Normally when you sign an agreement, people are supposed to respect their word. Well, yes, but we have the same agreement with 13 different jurisdictions. And we are faced now with several jurisdictions in Canada that were quicker to act than my home province, than Newfoundland and Labrador, and then Quebec in choosing how to allocate these funds. And so the Minister of Finance has judged, and I agree with her, that it was in the economic and environmental interests of Canada to move as quickly as possible to allocate those funds. As I said, it doesn't mean that projects will be ended, but you have to choose the list of, because the list of potential projects is so huge, we'll never have enough money to carry them all out. Well, Mr. Minister, when I sign an agreement...
We have Ms. Ashton, who is joining us by video conference. Ms. Ashton, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and hello, Mr. Minister. In the last while, Canadians across the country have lived firsthand extreme weather events that are increasingly common as a result of climate change. Last summer, Lytton, BC was burned to the ground following horrifying wildfires that ravaged the West Coast. Last fall, a month's worth of rain fell onto the south coast of BC over 2 days last fall, forcing over 15,000 people to leave their homes. Lives were lost and communities were destroyed. Ottawa, where this committee is taking place, is still dealing with the fallout of a storm so extreme that 350,000 people lost power. The Northwest Territories, Northern Ontario have been dealing with unprecedented flooding in recent weeks. In my riding, Peguis First Nation had to evacuate over 1,800 people. More than 700 homes were impacted. And this is a community that has dealt with flooding 5 times in the last 16 years. Every year, we see more and more of these extreme weather events. It's only getting worse, yet it seems the federal government is always reacting to these events and not making the type of long-term sustainable investments to help communities keep themselves safe in the face of climate change. Peguis, for example, has asked for flood mitigation investments to stay safe for over a decade, but the government has largely refused to deliver. I have put forward a bill C-245 to reform the Canada Infrastructure Bank to support communities in the fight against climate change. The word is that the government will vote against this bill. So my question is, on what grounds? On what grounds is your government willing to say no to supporting communities to survive in the face of climate change and to finally put the Canada Infrastructure Bank to good use?
Well, Mr. Chair, through you to Ms. Ashton, thank you for the questions. I say plural because there were probably half a dozen different elements that our colleague touched on in her question. It won't surprise you, Mr. Chair, that I don't share her view that the government hasn't done anything to get ahead of these extreme weather events and the challenges that represents for infrastructure across the country. She properly identified some of the devastating circumstances in British Columbia, the atmospheric river event, the fires in Lytton. I was in her province of Manitoba a few weeks ago, saw the flooding, the circumstances of the flooding in some parts of southern Manitoba. So all across the country, we have examples, highways cut off in Mr. Rogers' province of Newfoundland and Labrador because of washouts on the Trans-Canada Highway. So right across the country, there are these very expensive and very dangerous events taking place that cause considerable damage to infrastructure and obviously represent a considerable risk to human safety as well. So I don't think that the Infrastructure Bank should be the first and only place that we would go to do this important work with provinces and territories. As our colleague will know, in 2018, the government committed $3.4 billion to a disaster mitigation and adaptation fund. This isn't an infrastructure bank program, which is a loan. This is actual federal money made available to help communities remain resilient in the face of natural disasters. To date, $2.1 billion of funding has been put out to 70 projects across the country to mitigate the threats of natural disasters, floods, wildfires, and droughts. I think the Canada Infrastructure Bank should and can play a supporting role in some of these projects. For example, in some of the irrigation projects on the prairie, some water management, projects.
I'm just mindful of the time here and appreciate the feedback in terms of what government is doing. And I do want to bring it back to the Infrastructure Bank to find out exactly what it is they are doing. Let's be frank. I imagine that 5 years ago, what your government envisioned when it comes to the Infrastructure Bank was quite different than what we have today. In conversations with a number of your MPs, it's clear that the CIB is not being seen as doing the work that it should be doing. But I want to focus in particularly on one subset of communities that are face the greatest infrastructure challenges, and that is Indigenous communities. We know for First Nations, the infrastructure gap is $25 to $30 billion. And when you look at the Infrastructure Bank, we know that they have rejected historic numbers of projects relating to Indigenous communities because those projects were seen as being too small. Do you think that the Infrastructure Bank should prioritize projects for Indigenous communities and be better represented by including Indigenous representation on its board?
Mr. Chair, again, to our colleague, Ms. Ashton, thank you for the question. I certainly believe, as I know all members do, that the Infrastructure Bank, like every other agency or department of our government, should focus on closing the infrastructure gap that exists for Indigenous communities. So the short answer to her question, do I think that the Infrastructure Bank should play a role in supporting Indigenous-led infrastructure across the country? Of course they should. And I've had those discussions with the board chair. I've had those discussions with the CEO. We're looking at renewing the board of the Infrastructure Bank. We're always looking for qualified Indigenous persons that could serve on important boards like this. There is one Indigenous person who currently serves on the board of the Infrastructure Bank, but there's a vacancy. Some directors will be replaced over the coming months. So again, if colleagues have suggestions, Ms. Ashton represents a part of the great province of Manitoba that has some of Canada's best Indigenous leadership in her province. If there are people and others that colleagues have as suggestions for Indigenous directors of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, we'd be all ears and look forward to including them if we can in a way going forward.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ashton, and thank you, Minister. Colleagues, if there are no objections, as you can see, the bells are ringing. I propose that we continue our discussions and questioning until 12:55. That would give you 16 minutes to make your way to the House, should you choose to do so. Seeing no objections. Pardon? I don't believe we're going to have time to do that. Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Clerk. We will not have time to do that. So with that in mind, we'll turn the floor over now to Ms. Landsman. Ms. Landsman, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you, Minister, for returning to this committee and to the officials for taking the time. I want to continue off from where my colleague started. And I know that you see this as more complicated, but the number of projects that the CIB started 6 years ago, or 6 years into existence, was 33, and 0 were completed. And I get that there's a lot of work, but is the number still, are we still at 33 in terms of projects started?
Mr. Chair, Ms. Landsman, thank you. In order to provide the most precise information possible to a very reasonable question, perhaps Mr. Campbell can offer the exact number.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, just to remind that CIB is engaged in advising, investing, as well as providing research and analysis to many communities, provinces, municipalities, Indigenous groups about their projects, bringing in structuring at a very early stage. There are currently 34 projects to which the CIB has made a formal investment commitment. Those are outlined on its website. There are many, many more that are active under consideration, either in advising or structuring due diligence consideration. As many of these projects are the more complicated variety involving the private sector, often they start earlier and are engaged, and some of them, because of their complexity, will take longer to complete. The CIB also is not a procurement entity, so it's it itself not delivering the projects. It is actually making the commitment to enable them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So from 33 to 34. Minister, the last time you were at this committee, rightfully, you said that the CIB, like my colleague said, needed to raise its game. And this is obviously a committee that has recommended the dismantling of the CIB. You committed to communicating your expectations to the bank. I want to know, for the sake of the committee, are you seeing any improvements in the last 3 months? Was there any communication to the CIB?
So I think the short answer, Mr. Chair, is yes. There have been extensive and ongoing discussions with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. As I said, the chair, the board chair, or the CEO are people with whom I will have regular conversations and updates. They were in Ottawa and updated me about a month ago. I have made very clear, as have my colleagues at the table who represent our department, which is the shareholder of the bank. We have explained to them our expectations, and I am very confident that we're seeing month over month an increase, as Mr. Campbell said, both in terms of the bank's outreach to potential investors, to potential project advocates, and we're going to see over the coming months a growing list in every part of the country. I'm obviously focused on that coming from Atlantic Canada to ensure that we have the right regional balance in terms of where the bank is able to support projects as well. So I remain very confident that we have seen and will see an increased role.
Let's talk about a couple of those investments. We talked about Fortis last time. You mentioned it on whether you. I want to know from a seasoned minister, from somebody who has been in and around government a long time. Does the investment in Fortis, a company with $9 or $10 billion of profit, do you think that's appropriate as the main shareholder of the bank?
Well, you will, Mr. Chair, our colleague, Ms. Landsman, will understand that one of the reasons why we set up a structure like a Crown Corporation is precisely so the board of directors and the senior executives of the bank are the ones that make those individual investment decisions. So I'm not involved in the decision to allocate X million dollars to Project Y. We give the bank a set of expectations. We give them direction in terms of the areas we'd like to see them work. I am confident that the bank makes those decisions on the best interest of Canadian taxpayers. Mr. Campbell said...
So the investment is actually in the project, it's not in the company. So ITC Fortis is a counterparty.
As a steward of our tax dollars, again, and a minister in this government, is a project like Fortis, do you think it's appropriate?
Well, the board of directors of the Canada Infrastructure Bank thought that that project was important. And I think, Mr. Campbell, I hadn't thought of it as concisely as he did, but we have to be careful not to pick a series of partners in any one project and decide, is that the right particular corporate entity that should participate in a particular project? That certainly doesn't feel like the role of a minister, and I'm sure the due diligence of the bank took all that into account.
Thank you very much, Minister.
That's
Sorry,
too
Mr.
bad.
Landsman.
I was just getting started.
Thank you, Ms. Landsman. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Minister. It's good to see you today. Minister, as you know, of course, infrastructure needs are appearing across the country, particularly in rural and northern areas like we find in Newfoundland and Labrador and your province in New Brunswick. So we are already receiving support from the rural and northern communities infrastructure stream to upgrade roads and marine infrastructure, among other things, in Bonavista, Beer and Trinity, my riding, of course. But there's always more to be done. And every day, Canadians know the needs best of what needs to be done. So the National Infrastructure Assessment is a step in the right direction to determine these needs. So could you please describe the engagement you received from Canadians surrounding the development of this initiative and what the next steps are for its implementation?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you, and Mr. Rogers, thank you for the question, but thank you for your leadership in advocating for some of these smaller rural communities and their particular infrastructure needs across the country. So if it's true in your great riding in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, it's true in other small communities across the country. I can tell you I had a lengthy conversation with your Premier last evening, and as I said to your colleagues on the other side of the table, Newfoundland and Labrador has a considerable balance left in its infrastructure funding. And I said to the Premier, as we said to our friend from the Bloc, I said to the Premier of your province that we had a very short timeline to work with the members of Parliament from his province to identify those projects where we could invest. And as you said, Mr. Rogers, and I think he referred to some conversations he had with you last week as well, in your province, roads, the Trans-Canada Highway is a critical piece of the economic infrastructure of the island that you represent. So I'm very confident that with the province of Newfoundland and Labrador in the coming months, we will find a great list of investments that Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador and some smaller municipalities that would participate in other kinds of projects would be able to make. The National Infrastructure Assessment was something that our government thought was important, modeled on work that, for example, is done in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom. A number of other jurisdictions have an independent sort of professional assessment long-term of the infrastructure needs of communities, if it's rapid transit, if it's water and wastewater infrastructure. So we're in the process of finalizing what would be. You'll note that in the budget a year and a few months ago, we were allocated $20-some million to set up this national infrastructure assessment. We're well on our way. The first step, as you properly noted, was to consult with Canadians. And I forget the number of hundreds. 300. We had over 300 submissions. Canadians, and many of them are experts in the field. You can think of, I spoke at the Canadian Association of Civil Engineers meeting in British Columbia last week. These are the kind of people who had very thoughtful ideas. I had a conversation with them about the National Infrastructure Assessment. So we think there's a real appetite to participate in this work. But, Mr. Rogers, I will make sure that it's not only a few big cities that drive that conversation, but that work is also relevant in small communities like the ones that you and I represent.
And I truly appreciate that, Minister. The other question I have for you is around the fixed link project that we've talked about between Labrador and the island portion of the province.
Brunswick and PEI, that
no, it's
that one's going well. It's 25 years old.
and Newfoundland, of course, the island of Newfoundland. I wonder if you could give us an update on what's the status of the report that's being done that's examining that particular project.
Thank you for the question. And those projects are truly transformational. We saw, and our colleagues from Prince Edward Island talked to us about what it meant. It's disturbing now that people in the bridge to PEI leaves from my riding and goes to PEI. So people go to PEI on holidays and come and take like a day trip and then turn around and go back to the island because of the bridge. But they can be transformational to local economies, to supply chains, back to Mr. Badaway's comment. So as you'll know, Mr. Rogers, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, in its advisory consultative capacity that Mr. Campbell spoke of, did an initial assessment of a potential fixed link between the island of Newfoundland and Labrador. My understanding is they have completed a preliminary assessment or an initial assessment. That work has been given by the bank to the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, and I look forward to having an opportunity with our colleagues from your province and the government of Newfoundland and Labrador to looking at what are the next steps. But I haven't had any specific conversations with the Premier or with ministers in the provincial government, but I know that they now have at least the initial assessment based on the Infrastructure Bank's work of a year and a half ago. And I'd be happy to get you more information on that exact project.
I would love to have that information, Minister. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, and thank you, Minister. Pour terminer les questions aujourd'hui, nous...
To wrap up questions today, we have Mr. Barcelo-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Within the same bilateral agreement that I was referring to earlier, the Canada-Quebec, and for the Investing in Canada, and 3A and B, your government mentioned that funds, for example, for transit, public transit, and for water treatment that are not used in Phase 1 could be used and other components of the Investing in Canada program. So obviously in Quebec. So I'd like to know, in fact, because when we look at the information that's available, it seems that there are some $300 million that haven't been spent. So my question would be, if has your government transferred those funds into the remaining Investing in Canada envelope for the province of Quebec? We can provide you with the specific amounts, Mr. Barcelo-Duval, but no, we have not transferred either in Quebec, Ontario, or other provinces funds that have not been spent. And now I just want to make sure that you're talking about former programs that existed under the preceding government. No, I'm talking about the Investing in Canada and the 2018 agreement at sections 3A and B. So it's your government. Yes, but like I said, I want to be very clear. The sums that were not spent or will not be spent I'm not using the words that I suggested to you. The funds that were not allocated before the 31st of March will be taken back by the Receiver General. They will not be transferred to the province. No province will benefit from those funds if we can't agree on a joint list of projects that will take a certain number of time. I don't want you to be pessimistic. I'm confident we will agree. Yes, but for 3A and B, it talks about programs that sunset on the 31st of March 2020. So I want to know if those funds will still be available up until March 2023. No. Now you're talking about funds that were allocated to Phase 1. And the officials call that the legacy funds, funds that existed for other programs. But those monies that were not allocated or spent will not go into the current program, as you have noted, that must be allocated before March 31st of next year. Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Barsalou-Duval.
And your department officials for appearing before committee today. It was indeed the enjoyable experience we thought it would be, and we look forward to hosting you once again in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to colleagues.
This meeting stands adjourned.